You're lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when a thought crosses your mind that you can't quite shake. What if everything we know, everything we've built, every certainty we cling to, is just a thin veneer over something vast and incomprehensible? What if the universe isn't indifferent to humanity, but something worse? What if it simply doesn't notice us at all, like we might not notice the bacteria on our skin? This uncomfortable thought, this feeling of cosmic insignificance mixed with existential dread, has a name. It's called Lovecraftian horror. Welcome back to Midnight Deep Dive. Or if you're new here, welcome to our cozy corner of the internet, where we explore the fascinating stories and ideas that have shaped human culture. Tonight, we're venturing into the strange and shadowed world of H.P. Lovecraft, the reclusive writer from Providence, Rhode Island, who transformed horror fiction forever by asking one simple question: what if the universe itself is the monster? So find your most comfortable position, let the day's tensions drift away, and join me as we explore the life, work, and enduring influence of one of horror's most controversial and visionary writers. Howard Phillips Lovecraft was born on August 20, 1890, in Providence, Rhode Island, into a world that was already falling apart around him. His father, Winfield Scott Lovecraft, was a traveling salesman who suffered a complete mental breakdown when Howard was just 3 years old. Winfield was committed to Butler Hospital, where he would remain until his death 5 years later. The official cause of death was listed as general paresis, a late stage of syphilis that destroys the brain and nervous system. For young Howard, this meant his father transformed from a present, if often absent, figure into something terrifying and incomprehensible, a theme that would echo throughout his later work. Howard's mother, Sarah Susan Phillips Lovecraft, came from a more established Providence family, and after her husband's institutionalization, she moved with Howard back to the family home. This Victorian mansion at 454 Angel Street would become Howard's entire world for much of his childhood. His grandfather, Whipple Van Buren Phillips, was a successful businessman who filled the house with books, told the boy elaborate stories, and encouraged his precocious grandson's intellectual development. It was here, surrounded by Gothic architecture and his grandfather's library, that Howard began his lifelong love affair with the 18th century, with antiquarian pursuits, and with the past in general. But the Phillips household was not a happy one. Howard's mother, traumatized by her husband's illness and death, became increasingly unstable herself. She was overprotective to an extreme degree, dressing Howard in girls' clothing until he was 6, constantly warning him about the dangers of the world, and telling him repeatedly that he was too ugly and strange to ever be accepted by normal society. She had her own periods of mental illness and was eventually institutionalized herself, dying in the same hospital where her husband had died in 1921. Howard was a profoundly isolated child. He suffered from what were probably night terrors, vivid nightmares featuring creatures he called night gaunts, faceless, black, horned beings that would carry him through space. These nightmares were so intense and recurring that they shaped his understanding of horror from his earliest years. He was kept out of school frequently due to mysterious illnesses that were probably psychosomatic, the result of severe anxiety. When he did attend, he was often bullied for being strange, overdressed in the antiquated clothing his mother insisted upon, and for speaking in an oddly formal, old-fashioned manner. In his isolation, Howard created his own world through books. He devoured his grandfather's library, reading Greek and Roman mythology, Arabian Nights, Gothic novels, and scientific texts. By age 6, he was writing his own stories. By 8, he was attempting to revive Greek polytheism, building little shrines to various gods in the backyard. This wasn't merely childish play. It was Howard's first attempt to find meaning and structure in a world that seemed fundamentally hostile and incomprehensible. The Gothic landscape of Providence itself seeped into Howard's developing imagination. The city was full of colonial architecture, dark colonial cemeteries with tilting headstones bearing names from the 1600s and winding streets that seemed to belong to an earlier era. He would take long walks through the old sections of Providence, particularly around College Hill, absorbing the atmosphere of aged New England. The weather itself seemed Gothic to him. The harsh winters, the fog rolling in from Narragansett Bay, the way autumn transformed the landscape into something beautiful and dying simultaneously. When Howard's beloved grandfather died in 1904, the family's financial situation collapsed. They were forced to sell the Angel Street mansion and move to a much smaller house nearby. For 14-year-old Howard, this was a catastrophe. He later wrote that he seriously considered ending his life during this period, so devastated was he by the loss of his grandfather and the home that had been his sanctuary. The move represented everything Howard feared: change, loss, the decay of the old order, the inability to maintain stability in a chaotic universe. His teenage years were marked by nervous breakdowns that prevented him from finishing high school. He never attended college, despite his obvious intellectual abilities, another source of shame and disappointment that would haunt him throughout his life. Instead, he became increasingly reclusive, living with his mother and aunts, reading voraciously, writing constantly, and developing the habits of a nocturnal existence. He would stay up all night reading and writing, then sleep through much of the day, a pattern he maintained for most of his adult life. During these years, Howard discovered the Pulp magazines, particularly Weird Tales and Argosy. These cheaply printed magazines featured sensational stories of adventure, horror, and the supernatural. Howard began writing letters to the magazines, first complaining about stories he disliked, then engaging in lengthy correspondence with other readers and writers. His letters were remarkably detailed, often thousands of words long, written in his elegant, antiquated prose style. Through these letters, he began to build a community of friends and fellow writers he called his gang or circle, despite never meeting most of them in person. The world outside Providence was undergoing revolutionary changes that Howard found deeply disturbing. The early 20th century brought modernism in art, jazz music, new immigration patterns, urbanization, and social upheaval. World War I shattered old certainties about civilization and progress. Einstein's theories of relativity challenged fundamental assumptions about space and time. Quantum mechanics suggested that reality at its most basic level was strange, uncertain, and fundamentally unknowable. All of these developments fed into Howard's growing philosophy of cosmicism. The idea that humanity occupies no special place in the universe, that our existence is infinitesimally brief and insignificant on a cosmic scale. Howard's relationship with his mother remained complicated until her death. She continued to tell him he was ugly and unmarriageable, even as she depended on him emotionally. When she was institutionalized in 1919 for depression and nervous conditions, Howard visited her regularly, but her death in 1921 left him feeling both freed and bereft. He was 30 years old, living with his aunts, with no regular income and no prospects. Surprisingly, 1921 also brought Howard into contact with the wider world of amateur journalism, a network of hobbyist writers and publishers. He attended amateur journalism conventions, began publishing his own amateur journal, and actually started socializing with people beyond his letter-writing circles. It was at one of these conventions in 1921 that he met Sonia Green, a successful businesswoman 7 years his senior, who ran a hat shop in New York City. Sonia was everything Howard wasn't: outgoing, worldly, financially independent, Jewish, and comfortable with modern life. Their courtship was conducted largely through letters, as Howard remained in Providence while Sonia lived in New York. Despite their vast differences, they married in 1924, and Howard moved to New York City, leaving Providence for the first time in his adult life. The marriage was troubled from the start. Sonia's business failed, and she had to take jobs in other cities, leaving Howard alone in New York. Howard, who had idealized New York as a center of culture, found the reality overwhelming. The crowds, the noise, the diversity of the city's population, particularly the immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, filled him with anxiety and revulsion. His letters from this period are filled with racist diatribes about the mongrelization of New York, describing non-Anglo-Saxon immigrants in terms that are genuinely shocking to read today. He attempted to find work, but was spectacularly unsuccessful at every conventional job he tried. He was temperamentally unsuited to regular employment, too strange, too proud, too antiquated in his manners and expectations. His health, never robust, deteriorated in New York. He felt like an alien in his own time, disconnected from the modern world around him. After 2 years, Howard retreated back to Providence, back to his aunt's house, back to the only place where he felt he belonged. His marriage to Sonia effectively ended, though they never divorced. He would spend the remaining years of his life living in Providence, in increasing poverty, writing prolifically, but earning almost nothing from his work. He survived on a small inheritance and by doing revision work for other writers, essentially ghostwriting and editing for a few cents per page. These Providence years, from 1926 until his death in 1937, were paradoxically his most productive and his most desperate. He wrote his greatest stories during this period: The Call of Cthulhu, The Color Out of Space, At the Mountains of Madness, The Shadow over Innsmouth. He maintained enormous correspondence with fellow writers, offering encouragement, criticism, and collaboration. He took occasional trips to visit friends and to see historical sites, always gravitating toward the oldest, most atmospheric locations he could find. But he was also slowly starving. Too proud to accept direct charity, too unsuccessful to earn a living from his writing, Howard's health declined as his nutrition suffered. He ate irregularly, survived on cheap foods, and ignored mounting health problems. When he finally sought medical help in early 1937, the diagnosis was grim: terminal intestinal cancer, far too advanced for treatment. He died on March 15, 1937, at the age of 46, in the same hospital where both his parents had died. His death went largely unnoticed beyond his circle of correspondence. There were no obituaries in major newspapers, no recognition that anything significant had been lost. He had published most of his work in pulp magazines under his own name, and sometimes under pseudonyms, earning at most a few $100s total for his life's work. The copyrights to his stories were a mess, and much of his work would fall into public domain or disputed ownership after his death. The Providence he loved, the 18th century colonial city he tried to preserve in his imagination and his work, was already disappearing even as he lived in it. The old houses were being torn down for modern development. The families with names from colonial times were dying out or moving away. The world was becoming modern, international, connected in ways that would have horrified Howard even more than the changes he witnessed in his lifetime. Yet Howard Phillips Lovecraft, the lonely, strange, troubled man who lived almost his entire life in one small city, who never found success or recognition in his lifetime, who held views that we now recognize as reprehensible, somehow created something that would outlive him and grow stronger with each passing decade. From his isolated room in Providence, through his stories of cosmic horror and his philosophy of human insignificance, he changed horror fiction forever. The question is, how did he do it? To understand what made Lovecraft's horror revolutionary, we need to understand what horror was before him, and what fundamental shift he introduced that changed everything that came after. Traditional horror, the ghost stories and gothic tales that dominated the genre before Lovecraft, operated on certain assumptions about the universe. There were good and evil, God and the devil, the natural and the supernatural. Ghosts were the spirits of the dead. Vampires were cursed beings that could be defeated with crosses and holy water. Werewolves could be killed with silver bullets. Even when these creatures were terrifying, they operated within a moral framework. The universe, however dark it might seem, ultimately had meaning and structure. More importantly, the supernatural in traditional horror was scaled to human comprehension. A ghost haunting a house, a vampire stalking victims in a village, a monster prowling a moor. These were threats that humans could understand, confront, and potentially defeat. The hero might die in the attempt, the price might be terrible, but victory was theoretically possible. Human courage, faith, knowledge, or virtue could make a difference. Lovecraft looked at this tradition and decided it wasn't horrifying enough. Not because traditional ghost stories couldn't be scary. He appreciated many of them, but because they weren't true to what he believed about the universe. They imposed human meaning on a cosmos that had none. They suggested that humanity mattered, that our struggles had cosmic significance, that good and evil were real forces rather than human constructs. His philosophy of cosmicism rejected all of this. Lovecraft believed, based on his understanding of astronomy and his materialist worldview, that humanity was utterly insignificant in the vast cosmos. We exist on a tiny planet orbiting an unremarkable star in an ordinary galaxy among billions of galaxies. Our entire history, from the first emergence of life to the present day, is less than a blink on cosmic timescales. And when we're gone, the universe will continue without noticing our absence. This wasn't nihilism exactly, though it bordered on it. Lovecraft didn't think existence was meaningless in the sense of being futile or depressing. He found beauty and interest in many things, but he believed that meaning was something humans created, not something built into the fabric of reality. And if meaning is only a human construct, then beyond our tiny sphere of existence, the universe operates according to principles we might not be able to comprehend, governed by forces that don't care about human categories of good and evil. This philosophy became the foundation of what we now call cosmic horror or Lovecraftian horror. Instead of ghosts and vampires, Lovecraft created entities that existed on scales beyond human comprehension. These beings weren't evil in any meaningful sense. They simply existed, pursuing goals and operating according to logics that had nothing to do with humanity. The horror came not from malicious intent, but from radical indifference, from the recognition that we don't matter. His breakthrough story, The Call of Cthulhu, written in 1926 and published in 1928, perfectly demonstrates this approach. The story is told through documents and testimonies pieced together by a narrator investigating his late uncle's mysterious research. Slowly, a picture emerges of a vast entity called Cthulhu, currently sleeping in a sunken city called Arlae somewhere in the South Pacific. This being isn't a demon or a god in any traditional sense. It's something that exists on a scale that makes such categories meaningless. The story's most famous passage expresses Lovecraft's philosophy directly. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little, but someday the piecing together of dissociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality, and of our frightful position therein, that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age. This passage contains the essence of cosmic horror, the idea that reality is fundamentally different from what we assume, that true knowledge of our place in the cosmos would drive us insane, and that our ignorance is actually protective. It's horror based not on supernatural evil, but on the terrifying nature of reality itself. Lovecraft's entities and concepts reflected this cosmicism in specific ways. Cthulhu, the most famous of his creations, is described as being enormous, vaguely humanoid but with an octopus-like head, dragon wings, and a gelatinous body. He's currently sleeping, but even in sleep, his dreams influence sensitive humans across the world, causing nightmares, madness, and the formation of cults that worship him without understanding what he truly is. When he wakes, he won't destroy humanity out of malice. Will simply be in the way of his incomprehensible purposes. Azathoth, another of Lovecraft's creations, is even more abstract. This entity is described as a blind, idiot god at the center of the universe, constantly producing mindless, chaotic sounds that somehow structure all of reality. Azathoth isn't conscious in any sense we'd recognize, yet entire universes exist as byproducts of this entity's existence. How do you fight something like that? How do you even conceptualize it? Nyarlathotep, the crawling chaos, serves as something like a messenger or agent of the other cosmic entities, and takes various forms when interacting with humans. But even this entity, the most humanized of Lovecraft's creations, doesn't operate according to human morality or logic. It seems to enjoy causing madness and chaos, but not in the way a villain enjoys evil. More like how we might idly kick an anthill, curious about the response, but fundamentally unconcerned with the individual ants. The structure of Lovecraft's stories reinforces this cosmic horror through specific techniques. His narrators are often academics, researchers, or otherwise educated people who stumble onto forbidden knowledge. They might be investigating family history, researching ancient civilizations, or exploring unusual geological formations. Whatever the specific premise, the story follows their gradual realization that reality is not what they thought. This realization typically drives the characters toward madness. Lovecraft uses madness not as a plot device, but as a thematic element. The suggestion that human minds are literally not equipped to process certain truths. When his characters encounter cosmic entities or learn certain facts about reality, their minds break under the strain. This isn't weakness. It's a design limitation, like trying to run modern software on a computer from the 1980s. The geography of Lovecraft's horror is also significant. He set many of his stories in New England, particularly in fictional towns like Arkham, Innsmouth, and Dunwich. These locations are decayed, isolated places where the old America still lingers but is rotting from within. The architecture is colonial, the families are old and inbred, the towns are dying economically and spiritually. This setting reflects Lovecraft's own anxieties about modernity and change, but it also creates the perfect atmosphere for cosmic horror. Places where the facade of civilization is thin, where ancient things might still lurk, where the past refuses to stay buried. He also frequently used the Arctic, the deep ocean, and remote deserts as settings. These are places where humans don't belong, where our technology and civilizations provide only the thinnest protection against hostile environments. In these locations, Lovecraft's characters discover ancient cities, impossible ruins, and evidence of cosmic forces that have been present on Earth far longer than humanity has existed. The concept of forbidden knowledge is central to Lovecraft's work. His stories often feature ancient texts, the most famous being the Necronomicon, supposedly written by the mad Arab Abdul-al-Hazred. These books contain information about the true nature of reality, spells or formulas for contacting cosmic entities, and histories of civilizations that existed before humanity. Reading these books is dangerous not because they're cursed in a supernatural sense, but because the knowledge they contain is corrosive to human sanity. This reflects Lovecraft's complicated relationship with knowledge and science. He loved learning, valued rationality, and believed in the scientific method. Yet his stories suggest that there might be truths that we're better off not knowing, realities that we can't process without psychological destruction. It's a fundamentally pessimistic view of human capacity and cosmic reality. The prose style Lovecraft developed to convey cosmic horror has become so distinctive that it's now frequently parodied. He favored adjectives like eldritch, cyclopean, non-Euclidean, blasphemous, and unnameable. His descriptions often emphasized that things couldn't be properly described. Buildings with wrong angles, creatures whose appearance defied geometry, colors that don't exist in the normal spectrum. This verbal inadequacy is intentional. Lovecraft is trying to convey things that language can't properly express, horrors that exceed human capacity to comprehend or communicate. His stories also frequently end not with victory, but with characters fleeing, going mad, or simply trying to forget what they've learned. The classic horror story ending might involve destroying the vampire or exorcising the ghost, restoring normalcy. Lovecraft's stories often end with the realization that normalcy was always an illusion, that the horror is still out there, and that human efforts to combat it are futile at best. This was genuinely revolutionary. Lovecraft removed human significance from horror. His entities didn't care about us. They couldn't be fought with courage, defeated with knowledge, or redeemed through virtue. They simply existed, vast and terrible, and the best we could hope for was to avoid their attention. This inverted the assumptions that had governed horror fiction for centuries. Yet despite this bleakness, or perhaps because of it, Lovecraft's approach to horror proved incredibly influential and generative. By removing traditional religious and moral frameworks from horror, he created space for new types of stories, new sources of dread. The universe as vast, cold, and indifferent rather than as a battleground between good and evil. This resonated with readers living in the 20th century, an age that had seen traditional certainties shattered by world wars, atomic weapons, and scientific discoveries that revealed how small and recent humanity really is. Cosmic horror spoke to modern anxieties in ways that traditional ghost stories couldn't. What's scarier in an age of nuclear weapons and existential philosophy? A vampire you can defeat with garlic, or the realization that existence itself might be fundamentally hostile or indifferent to human well-being. One of Lovecraft's most significant innovations was the creation of what's now called the Cthulhu Mythos, an interconnected fictional universe with recurring entities, locations, and concepts that appeared across multiple stories. This wasn't something Lovecraft planned from the beginning. It emerged organically from his work and was significantly expanded by other writers, both during his lifetime and after his death. The development of this shared universe represents one of the earliest examples of what we now call world-building in speculative fiction. The term Cthulhu Mythos was actually coined by August Derleth, a friend and correspondent of Lovecraft's who became his literary executor after his death. Lovecraft himself never used this term, instead occasionally referring to his interconnected stories as Yog-Sothothery, after one of his cosmic entities. But whatever we call it, the mythos represents a coherent fictional framework that gives structure to cosmic horror, while maintaining its essential unknowability. At the heart of the mythos are the cosmic entities that Lovecraft created. These beings are sometimes called Great Old Ones or Outer Gods, though Lovecraft's terminology wasn't always consistent. They exist outside normal space and time, though they sometimes interact with our reality in ways that are catastrophic for humans who encounter them. Cthulhu, despite being one of the most famous, is actually relatively minor in the cosmic hierarchy that Lovecraft established. He's currently imprisoned or sleeping in the sunken city of Arlae, waiting for when the stars are right to awaken and reclaim the earth. Lovecraft describes him as being worshipped by various cults throughout history, with different cultures giving him different names. The creature has apparently been on Earth for millions of years, predating humanity by vast spans of time. Azathoth occupies the center of the mythos cosmology. This entity is described as the nuclear chaos at the center of all existence, a blind, idiot god whose random movements and sounds somehow structure reality itself. Around Azathoth dance the other gods, including entities like Nyarlathotep, who serves as something like a messenger or active principle in contrast to Azathoth's mindless chaos. Yog-Sothoth is another major entity in the mythos, described as coexistent with all time and space, knowing everything that has happened and will happen. Lovecraft describes Yog-Sothoth as appearing as a congregation of glowing spheres, though the entity can take other forms. In several stories, Yog-Sothoth serves as something like a gateway between dimensions, or as a source of forbidden knowledge about reality's true nature. Shub-Niggurath, called the Black Goat of the Woods with 1,000 young, is another outer god associated with fertility and perverse life. The entity appears in several stories as the object of cult worship, with devotees performing disturbing reproductive rituals in its honor. The name itself reflects Lovecraft's unfortunate habit of using racist terminology in his work, a point we'll address more fully later. What makes these entities effective as horror is their fundamental unknowability. Lovecraft provides just enough detail to make them concrete, physical descriptions, names, attributes, but always emphasizes that these descriptions are inadequate, that human language and comprehension can't properly capture what these beings truly are. They're simultaneously specific enough to be memorable and vague enough to remain mysterious. The mythos also includes a geography of horror. Lovecraft created several fictional New England towns that appear across multiple stories. Arkham, Massachusetts, is the most famous, home to the fictional Miskatonic University, which possesses a library containing many forbidden texts, including the Necronomicon. Arkham appears in numerous stories as a location where the boundaries between normal reality and cosmic horror are particularly thin. Innsmouth, another fictional Massachusetts town, serves as the setting for The Shadow over Innsmouth, one of Lovecraft's most famous stories. This decaying fishing village harbors a terrible secret. Its residents have interbred with fish-like creatures called Deep Ones, creating human hybrid beings that gradually transform into aquatic creatures. Innsmouth represents Lovecraft's horror of miscegenation and racial mixing made literal, a disturbing example of how his personal prejudices shaped his fictional horrors. Dunwich, yet another fictional Massachusetts town, appears in the Dunwich Horror as an isolated rural area where ancient evil persists. The town is described as particularly cursed, with residents who maintain old beliefs and practices, and where terrible things can happen away from civilizing influences. These fictional locations create a consistent geography of horror, suggesting that certain places are vulnerable to cosmic forces for reasons humans don't fully understand. The Necronomicon deserves special attention as perhaps the mythos' most influential creation. This fictional grimoire, supposedly written by Abdul-Hazred, the Mad Arab, contains information about the cosmic entities, spells for summoning them, and historical accounts of their interactions with various human civilizations. Lovecraft invented the book and referenced it across multiple stories, creating such convincing detail that readers often believed it was real. The Necronomicon's fictional history is elaborate. According to Lovecraft's various stories, it was originally written in Damascus around 730 CE, titled Al-Azif. The author, Abdul-Hazred, supposedly went mad from the knowledge he accumulated and was eventually killed by an invisible monster in broad daylight. The book was translated into Greek as Necronomicon, meaning roughly Book of Dead Names, then into Latin, and only a few copies survived various attempts to suppress and destroy it. This level of detail made the Necronomicon feel real, and Lovecraft enjoyed the confusion this caused. He sometimes played along when people asked about the book, while other times he clarified that he'd invented it. After his death, several hoax versions were published, and the Necronomicon achieved a strange cultural life of its own, appearing in occult catalogs and being referenced by people who genuinely believed it existed. What made the mythos particularly generative was Lovecraft's openness to collaboration and sharing. Unlike many writers who zealously guard their creations, Lovecraft actively encouraged his friends and fellow writers to use elements from his stories. He would write letters suggesting how his entities or concepts could be incorporated into others' work, effectively treating the mythos as open-source horror. This collaborative spirit created something unprecedented. Other writers began incorporating Lovecraftian elements into their stories, while Lovecraft included references to his friends' creations in his own work. Clark Ashton Smith created additional entities and locations that became part of the mythos. Robert E. Howard, famous for creating Conan the Barbarian, wrote stories that connected to the mythos. August Derleth extensively expanded the mythos after Lovecraft's death, sometimes in ways that Lovecraft might not have approved. Frank Belknap Long, another member of Lovecraft's circle, created the entity known as the Hounds of Tindalos, interdimensional predators that hunt through time and can only enter our reality through sharp angles rather than curves. Lovecraft referenced these creatures in his own work, demonstrating how the mythos became truly collaborative. This sharing created problems after Lovecraft's death. He'd been careless about copyright, often publishing in magazines that retained rights or selling stories outright for tiny sums. His literary executor, August Derleth, attempted to manage the mythos through his publishing house, Arkham House, but the legal situation was complicated. Many of Lovecraft's creations eventually fell into public domain or existed in a gray area where their copyright status was unclear. Derleth's expansion of the mythos was controversial. He attempted to impose more structure on Lovecraft's creations, organizing the cosmic entities into categories and suggesting they represented forces of good and evil in cosmic conflict. This directly contradicted Lovecraft's cosmicism, which rejected such moral frameworks. Derleth wrote numerous stories set in the mythos, some completing fragments Lovecraft had left unfinished, others wholly original. Purists argue that Derleth fundamentally misunderstood Lovecraft's vision, while others appreciate that his efforts kept the mythos alive during decades when Lovecraft's work might otherwise have been forgotten. The mythos also includes several forbidden books beyond the Necronomicon. The King in Yellow, borrowed from Robert W. Chambers' earlier work, appears in several mythos stories. The Pinacotic manuscripts, Unausprechlichen Kulten, Nameless Cults, and De Vermis Mysteries, Mysteries of the Worm, are other fictional grimoires that mythos writers created, adding layers of forbidden knowledge to the fictional universe. Various cults appear throughout the mythos, worshipping the cosmic entities with varying degrees of understanding. Some cults are portrayed as primitive and degenerate, particularly those in isolated locations. Others are sophisticated secret societies that have persisted across centuries. These cults rarely summon the entities they worship with any success, and when they do, the results are catastrophic. The cultists serve as human manifestations of cosmic horror, showing how exposure to these forces corrupts human society and psychology. The mythos also features various alien races that have interacted with Earth throughout its history. The Elder Things, featured in At the Mountains of Madness, are ancient beings who came to Earth billions of years ago and created life here, including humans, as a kind of accident or biological experiment. The Deep Ones, fish-frog hybrid creatures that live in ocean cities, occasionally interbreed with humans in coastal communities. The Migo, fungoid creatures from Yuggoth, which might be Pluto, occasionally visit Earth for mysterious purposes. These alien races add depth to the mythos by suggesting that Earth has always been a contested space, that humanity's dominance is recent and temporary, and that we share the planet with beings that preceded us and will probably outlast us. They reinforce the cosmic horror theme that humanity is neither central nor particularly important in the universe's grand scheme. The concept of mythos knowledge is crucial to understanding how the shared universe functions. Characters who study ancient texts, investigate strange phenomena, or encounter cosmic entities gain knowledge that changes them. This knowledge is corrosive. Once you know the truth about reality, you can't unknow it, and that knowledge makes it impossible to live comfortably in normal society. Many mythos stories feature characters who must choose between comforting ignorance and devastating truth. The mythos as Lovecraft and his circle developed, it wasn't a rigid, fully mapped universe with consistent rules. It was deliberately ambiguous, contradictory in places, always suggesting more than it revealed. Different stories gave different details about the same entities, and Lovecraft himself wasn't particularly concerned with maintaining perfect consistency. This flexibility made the mythos more effective as horror. If everything were clearly explained and consistently mapped, it would lose the essential quality of unknowability that makes cosmic horror work. The collaborative nature of the mythos also meant it could evolve and expand beyond what any single writer could create. Other writers brought their own sensibilities, created their own entities and locations, and explored different aspects of cosmic horror. The mythos became a shared playground for horror writers, a common vocabulary that could be remixed and reimagined. This model of a shared fictional universe would influence later developments in speculative fiction. The modern concept of world building, where writers create detailed fictional settings with consistent rules and histories, owes something to what Lovecraft and his circle developed. The idea that multiple writers could play in the same fictional sandbox, that universes could be open source rather than proprietary, also traces back to the mythos. But the mythos' success also created challenges. As it became more popular and more writers contributed to it, the original cosmic horror sometimes became diluted. Entities that were supposed to be incomprehensible became increasingly well-defined. The unknowable became known, the mysterious became explained. This tension between accessibility and incomprehensibility continues to challenge creators working with Lovecraftian themes today. To understand Lovecraft's place in literary history, we need to step into the world of 1920s and 1930s pulp magazines. Those cheaply printed, garishly covered publications that sold for 10 or 15 cents and filled newsstands across America. These magazines, printed on rough paper that would yellow and crumble within years, were dismissed by literary critics as trash, ephemeral entertainment for the masses. Yet they became the incubators for some of the most influential genre fiction of the 20th century, and provided the only real home for Lovecraft's work during his lifetime. The pulp magazine era began in the 1890s with publications like Argosy, but exploded in the early 20th century with hundreds of titles covering every conceivable genre. There were Western pulps, detective pulps, romance pulps, science fiction pulps, and of course, horror pulps. These magazines paid by the word, typically a cent or less per word, meaning even a lengthy story might earn a writer only $20 or $30. For most pulp writers, survival meant writing fast and publishing constantly, churning out stories under multiple names across different magazines. Weird Tales, founded in 1923, became the most important venue for horror and dark fantasy fiction. The magazine struggled financially throughout its existence, never achieving the circulation of more successful pulps, but it provided a crucial platform for writers working in the weird fiction tradition. The magazine's covers, often featuring scantily clad women menaced by monsters or tentacled horrors, were designed to catch eyes on crowded newsstands and scandalize, just enough to generate interest without getting banned. Lovecraft discovered Weird Tales in its early years and began submitting stories in 1923. His first published story in the magazine was Dagon, and over the next 14 years, Weird Tales would publish most of his significant work. But the relationship was often frustrating. The magazine's editor, Farnsworth Wright, rejected some of Lovecraft's best stories, including At the Mountains of Madness, which he found too long and too slow-paced for the pulp market. When Wright did accept Lovecraft's work, the payment was minimal, and often delayed for months due to the magazine's perpetual financial struggles. The pulp format shaped Lovecraft's work in specific ways. Stories needed to be engaging quickly, with hooks that would grab readers flipping through magazines. They needed to be relatively self-contained, though they could reference broader mythologies for readers who followed the magazine regularly. And they needed to deliver horror, strangeness, or excitement in ways that justified the purchase price. These constraints pushed Lovecraft toward particular narrative structures: the investigative story, the archaeological discovery, the family history that reveals terrible secrets. But pulp publishing also gave Lovecraft freedom that more respectable literary venues wouldn't have provided. Mainstream fiction of the 1920s and 30s was dominated by realism, by domestic dramas and social commentary. A story about an ancient god sleeping in a sunken city would have been unpublishable in literary magazines of the era. Weird tales and similar pulps were the only places where such wild imaginative flights were not just tolerated, but encouraged. The magazine also connected Lovecraft to a community of writers working in similar modes. Through Weird Tales, he discovered the work of Clark Ashton Smith, a California poet and writer who created elaborate dying earth fantasies and cosmic horror stories, with prose even more ornate than Lovecraft's own. Smith became one of Lovecraft's closest friends and most important correspondents, despite the two men never meeting in person until late in Lovecraft's life. Robert E. Howard, another Weird Tales regular, also became part of Lovecraft's circle. Howard, writing from rural Texas, was in many ways Lovecraft's opposite: physically robust, comfortable with violence, obsessed with barbarism and strength rather than civilization and antiquity. Yet Howard's best work, particularly his horror stories, showed clear Lovecraft influence, and the two men developed a friendship through correspondence. Howard's suicide in 1936, a year before Lovecraft's death, devastated Lovecraft and removed one of the few people who understood his work. The correspondence network that developed around Weird Tales and similar publications was extraordinary. Lovecraft was a prolific letter writer, sometimes producing 40 or 50 pages of single-spaced typescript to various correspondents. He would critique other writers' work in detail, suggest plot ideas, discuss philosophy and history, and share information about his own writing process. These letters, collected and published after his death, run to thousands of pages and provide invaluable insight into his thinking. This gang or circle of writers, as Lovecraft called them, engaged in something rare for the era: genuine literary collaboration and sharing. They would incorporate each other's creations into their stories, reference each other's fictional locations and entities, and essentially treat weird fiction as a collaborative project rather than individual competition. This generosity stemmed partly from the fact that there wasn't much money involved. With payments so minimal, there was little to compete over, but also from genuine fellowship and shared passion for the work. August Derleth, a Wisconsin writer who began corresponding with Lovecraft while still a teenager, would become crucial to preserving Lovecraft's legacy. Derleth was astonishingly prolific, eventually publishing over 150 books across multiple genres, but he never forgot his early correspondence with Lovecraft. When Lovecraft died, Derleth attempted to interest mainstream publishers in collecting his work, and when that failed, founded Arkham House specifically to publish Lovecraft's stories in proper book form. The pulp fiction world included many women writers, though they often published under male pseudonyms or initials to avoid reader prejudice. C.L. Moore, who wrote as Catherine Moore, created sophisticated weird fiction that challenged genre conventions. Her correspondence with Lovecraft was respectful, but sometimes contentious. She pushed back against some of his more extreme views while appreciating his literary innovations. Other women writers like Gray Laspina contributed to Weird Tales and the broader weird fiction community, though their work has often been overlooked in favor of their male contemporaries. The economic context of pulp publishing is important for understanding Lovecraft's struggles. Even successful pulp writers rarely earned substantial incomes. Robert E. Howard, one of the more financially successful members of the Weird Tales circle, was making a few $100s monthly at his peak, enough to support himself modestly, but not enough for security. Lovecraft, publishing less frequently and in fewer venues, earned far less, probably less than $1,000 total from his fiction during his lifetime. This economic reality meant that most pulp writers had to produce fiction constantly, working in multiple genres to maximize output. Lovecraft couldn't do this. He wrote slowly, revised extensively, and refused to compromise his vision to make stories more commercially viable. He also had psychological blocks about writing fiction for money, viewing commercial considerations as corrupting to art. This attitude, while admirable in some ways, ensured his poverty. The revision work Lovecraft did for other writers provided more reliable income than his original fiction. He would extensively rewrite other people's stories, essentially ghostwriting, while the original author received credit. This work was tedious and paid poorly, often just a few dollars per project, but it came more regularly than fiction sales. Some stories published under other authors' names were substantially Lovecraft's work, making the bibliography of his actual output complicated to determine. The pulp fiction world also had strict conventions and expectations that Lovecraft sometimes violated. Weird Tales readers expected clear resolutions, heroes who survived or at least defeated evil before dying, and narratives that maintained tension throughout. Lovecraft's stories sometimes meandered into extended descriptions of architecture or geology, prioritized atmosphere over action, and ended with ambiguity or outright defeat. These violations of pulp conventions meant that even when Farnsworth Wright accepted his stories, readers sometimes complained. Wright's rejection of At the Mountains of Madness, Lovecraft's longest and most ambitious work, exemplified these tensions. The novella, about an Antarctic expedition discovering an ancient alien city, was too long for serial publication in Weird Tales, and too slow-paced for readers expecting monster fights and dramatic action. The story eventually found publication in Astounding Stories, a science fiction pulp, where it appeared in 1936. Even there, it attracted mixed response, with some readers finding it fascinating and others bored by its extended descriptions and lack of conventional thrills. The pulp context also influenced what kind of horror Lovecraft created. Weird Tales readers expected the weird, the strange, the uncanny. They didn't want realistic psychological horror or subtle literary ambiguity. They wanted monsters, ancient evils, and cosmic threats. This audience expectation aligned well with Lovecraft's own sensibilities, allowing him to write the kind of horror he found genuinely frightening rather than what mainstream literary culture might have demanded. The visual component of pulp publishing shouldn't be overlooked. Cover art and interior illustrations were crucial for attracting readers and establishing atmosphere. Weird Tales employed various artists, and while the quality varied, the best illustrations captured something essential about the stories. Lovecraft himself was sometimes disappointed by illustrations for his work, feeling they made things too concrete, too defined, when the horror depended on vagueness and suggestion. This tension between visual and verbal horror continues in Lovecraft adaptations today. The pulp magazine world was also remarkably international in scope despite being mostly published in America. British, Australian, and even some European readers followed Weird Tales and similar publications. Correspondence networks connected writers across continents, creating a genuinely global community of weird fiction enthusiasts. This international dimension meant that Lovecraft's work, even during his lifetime, was reaching readers far beyond Rhode Island or even America. By the late 1930s, the pulp magazine era was beginning its decline. The Great Depression had weakened the industry financially. Radio was providing free entertainment that competed with cheap magazines, and reader tastes were shifting toward different kinds of stories. Weird tales limped along until 1954, but its golden age was the 1920s and 30s, exactly when Lovecraft was active. In some ways, Lovecraft died just as the platform that had sustained him, however barely, was beginning to crumble. Howard Phillips Lovecraft saw himself as a scientific materialist, someone who believed in reason, evidence, and the natural order of the universe. He rejected supernatural belief, organized religion, and anything that smacked of mysticism. Yet he spent his life writing stories about cosmic entities, forbidden knowledge, and realities beyond human comprehension. This apparent contradiction actually reveals something fundamental about Lovecraft's philosophy and why his horror remains so effective. He was exploring what happens when scientific understanding reveals that reality is more strange and terrible than any traditional supernatural belief. Lovecraft was born in the late Victorian era, just as scientific discoveries were radically transforming human understanding of the universe. Darwin's theory of evolution had shown that humans weren't specially created, but had evolved from earlier life forms over millions of years. Geology had revealed that the Earth was ancient beyond imagination, not the few thousand years suggested by literal biblical interpretation. Astronomy was showing that the universe was vastly larger than previously thought, with countless stars, and what we now call galaxies stretching into incomprehensible distances. These discoveries delighted Lovecraft intellectually, while simultaneously filling him with existential dread. If humans were just another animal species, evolved by chance rather than divine design, then what made us special? If the universe was billions of years old and incomprehensibly vast, then our entire history, from the first civilizations to the present day, was less than a blink. And if Earth was just one planet among countless worlds, then the idea that the universe existed for our benefit, or even noticed our existence, became absurd. Lovecraft called his philosophy cosmicism or cosmic indifferentism. The core idea was simple but profoundly unsettling. Humanity occupies no privileged position in the universe. We're not the center of creation, we're not particularly significant on cosmic scales, and when we're gone, the universe will continue without noting our absence. This wasn't quite nihilism. Lovecraft didn't think existence was meaningless or that nothing mattered. He thought meaning was something humans created, valuable within human contexts, but not built into the fabric of reality itself. This philosophy shaped his horror fiction in specific ways. Traditional horror, whether ghost stories or vampire tales, assumed a universe where supernatural forces took interest in humanity. Ghosts returned to haunt the living, demons tempted humans toward damnation, supernatural beings cared enough about us to threaten us. Even being terrorized by such beings implied a kind of significance. You mattered enough to be noticed, even if that attention was malevolent. Lovecraft rejected this framework entirely. His cosmic entities don't hate humanity because hate implies caring. They simply exist, pursuing goals we can't comprehend according to logics we can't follow. When they interact with humans, it's typically accidental or incidental to their actual purposes. We're not important enough to be hated or loved. We're just in the way, like insects might be in the way of human construction projects. This radical indifference is more horrifying than malevolence, because it denies us even the dignity of being worthy opponents. The scientific discoveries of Lovecraft's era particularly influenced specific stories. Einstein's theories of relativity, which showed that space and time were connected and could be warped by gravity, appear metaphorically in Lovecraft's descriptions of non-Euclidean geometry and impossible angles in alien architecture. He didn't understand the mathematics deeply, but he grasped that reality at fundamental levels was stranger than human intuition suggested. The Color Out of Space, one of Lovecraft's most acclaimed stories, explicitly involves scientific investigation of an inexplicable phenomenon. A meteor crashes near a farm, and slowly, everything in the area begins to change in ways that defy scientific understanding. Plants grow to impossible sizes but become inedible. Animals mutate grotesquely. A strange color, unlike anything in the normal spectrum, appears in the darkness. Scientists investigate but can't explain what's happening, and their instruments fail to measure crucial properties of the phenomenon. This story exemplifies Lovecraft's approach to science in his fiction. He respected scientific method and portrayed his investigator characters as rational people using proper procedures. But he also suggested that reality might contain phenomena that science can't adequately study or explain. Not because science is wrong or limited as a method, but because reality itself might not be fully amenable to human comprehension. At the Mountains of Madness even more explicitly engages with science. The story follows an Antarctic expedition that discovers an ancient city built by alien beings millions of years ago. The narrative is framed as a scientific report, with the narrator carefully describing geological formations, architectural details, and biological specimens. The expedition members are scientists, geologists, biologists, and other specialists, who attempt to understand their discoveries through rational analysis. What they discover is that Earth's biological history has been shaped by alien intervention. The Elder Things, ancient alien beings, came to Earth billions of years ago and created all life here, including humans, through biological experimentation. This revelation doesn't violate natural law. The Elder Things used biological and technological processes that are theoretically comprehensible. But it undermines human significance by revealing that we're not the product of divine creation or even natural evolution, but rather an accidental byproduct of alien experiments. Lovecraft's fascination with biology appears throughout his work. He was aware of Darwin's theories and the emerging field of genetics. His stories often feature biological mutation, hybrid creatures, and evolutionary processes taken to horrible extremes. The deep ones of Innsmouth represent evolution, continuing in directions humans find repulsive. The fungi creatures of The Whisperer in Darkness represent biology following completely different principles than Earth life. This biological horror reflects real scientific understanding while pushing it into disturbing territory. If evolution is true, then humans aren't the endpoint or pinnacle of natural history. We're just one branch on an enormous tree, and evolution continues regardless of whether its direction pleases us. Lovecraft imagined evolution producing forms of life that would find humans as primitive and limited as we find bacteria. His interest in astronomy and cosmology was equally significant. Lovecraft loved stargazing and kept up with astronomical discoveries of his era. When he learned that the universe was far larger than previously thought, that our galaxy was just one among countless others, that Earth was an infinitesimal speck in incomprehensible vastness, he felt both awe and terror. His fiction repeatedly emphasizes cosmic scale. Entities that exist across dimensions, beings whose existence spans eons, and forces that operate on scales where human life is too brief to even notice. The concept of deep time, geological and cosmic time measured in millions and billions of years, pervades Lovecraft's work. Ancient cities buried for eons, civilizations that rose and fell before humans existed, entities that sleep for thousands of years between periods of waking. These temporal scales make human history seem momentary and insignificant. We measure significance by human timescales, but on cosmic timescales, all of human existence is negligible. Lovecraft's materialism, his belief that only physical matter and energy exist without supernatural souls or spirits, created an interesting tension in his work. He didn't believe in actual magic or supernatural forces, yet he wrote stories full of magical rituals and supernatural entities. He resolved this by treating his cosmic entities as advanced aliens or extra-dimensional beings that operated according to natural laws we don't understand. Their magic was really just technology or biological capability beyond our science. This approach anticipated Arthur C. Clarke's famous observation that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Lovecraft's cosmic entities aren't supernatural in the sense of violating natural law. They simply operate according to natural laws we haven't discovered. Their apparent magic is our scientific ignorance, and learning to understand them properly drives humans insane, not because the knowledge is cursed, but because it reveals how limited human cognition really is. Philosophy deeply influenced Lovecraft's worldview, particularly the materialist philosophy of ancient Greece and the cosmic pessimism of certain modern philosophers. He read widely in philosophy, favoring thinkers who emphasized human limitations and cosmic insignificance. He rejected idealism and spiritualism in favor of strict materialism. The view that reality consists entirely of matter and energy following natural laws. But Lovecraft's materialism led him to conclusions that most materialists don't emphasize. If consciousness is just a product of material processes in the brain, then it's not special or privileged. Human thoughts, emotions, and experiences are just physical events in neural tissue, no different in kind from any other physical process. This realization, which Lovecraft found intellectually compelling, also filled him with melancholy. If consciousness isn't special, if it's just matter organized in a particular way, then the extinction of consciousness, whether individual death or species extinction, isn't cosmically significant. His fiction explores what he called the horror of reality, not supernatural horror, but the horror of understanding what reality actually is. In The Silver Key, one of his few stories with a protagonist similar to himself, the main character finds reality so disappointing and mundane that he seeks escape into dream and fantasy. This reflects Lovecraft's own feelings about modernity. He found the real world less interesting than his imaginary ones, less rich with meaning than ancient times he romanticized. Yet Lovecraft also valued truth over comfort. His stories suggest that however disturbing cosmic reality might be, knowing the truth is preferable to comforting delusions. Characters who refuse to acknowledge what they've learned or who retreat into denial are portrayed somewhat negatively. The truly admirable characters, rare in Lovecraft's fiction, are those who confront terrible truths without flinching, who maintain their rationality even as it reveals how limited human understanding is. This created the essential tension in Lovecraft's work, the conflict between the human need for meaning and the cosmic reality that offers none. We can't help but seek patterns, assign significance, and imagine ourselves as important. But honest examination of reality reveals that these are human constructs, not cosmic truths. Lovecraft's horror comes from this gap between what we want reality to be and what it actually is. We cannot discuss Lovecraft honestly without confronting what many consider the most troubling aspect of his life and work. His racism, xenophobia, and expressions of prejudice that are shocking, even accounting for the attitudes of his era. This isn't a minor biographical detail that can be glossed over or explained away. Lovecraft's prejudices were virulent, extensive, and directly influenced his fiction in ways that shape his work even now, decades after his death. Understanding this aspect of Lovecraft requires confronting uncomfortable truths about how creative genius can coexist with reprehensible beliefs. Lovecraft's racism was pronounced even by the standards of early 20th century America, which itself was a deeply racist society. He wrote letters containing slurs and rhetoric about racial purity that would have been acceptable in Klan meetings, but were extreme even in his own social circles. His correspondence includes passages describing non-Anglo-Saxon people as subhuman, as threats to civilization, as inherently inferior and disgusting. These weren't occasional statements made in anger. They reflected a consistent worldview that shaped his understanding of history, society, and human worth. The sources of his racism are complex and don't excuse it, but help us understand how it developed. His mother's family, the Phillipses, were old New England stock who prided themselves on their colonial ancestry. They held firmly to 18th century values and looked down on later immigrant groups. Lovecraft absorbed these attitudes from childhood, learning that being Anglo-Saxon and well-descended was essential to worth, and that other groups were degraded in comparison. His isolated upbringing reinforced these prejudices. Lovecraft had minimal contact with people different from himself during his formative years. He didn't attend school regularly, didn't have diverse friendships, and spent most of his time in a household that viewed the changing demographics of America with horror. When he did encounter people from other backgrounds, it was often in contexts that confirmed his prejudices. Poor neighborhoods, sensational news stories, or through the filtered perspectives of like-minded relatives. His time in New York from 1924 to 1926 intensified rather than challenged his racism. New York was experiencing massive immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, and the city's diversity overwhelmed Lovecraft. He wrote letters describing his revulsion at seeing immigrants on the streets, his disgust at hearing languages other than English, his conviction that these new arrivals were destroying American civilization. His wife Sonia was Jewish, which created cognitive dissonance he never fully resolved. He could love and respect individual people while maintaining hateful beliefs about their ethnic groups. This racism directly influenced his fiction in multiple ways. The most obvious is in the portrayal of non-white characters, who are almost uniformly depicted as degraded, primitive, or evil. His story, The Horror at Red Hook, features immigrant communities in Brooklyn engaged in supernatural evil, explicitly linking ethnic diversity with cosmic horror. The cultists who worship Cthulhu and other entities are frequently described in racist terms, with their non-Anglo features emphasized as evidence of their degeneration. The mixed-race inhabitants of Innsmouth, descendants of humans who interbred with fish-like deep ones, represent Lovecraft's horror of miscegenation, made literal. The story describes their physical degradation, their inhuman appearance, and their moral corruption in terms that clearly reflect racist anxieties about racial mixing. The narrator discovers he has Innsmouth ancestry and will eventually transform into one of these creatures, a plot that reflects fears of hidden racial contamination. Even stories without explicitly racial themes often encode racist assumptions. The notion that ancient civilizations possessed knowledge superior to modern understanding reflects Lovecraft's belief that past cultures, particularly ancient Greece and Rome, which he idealized, were superior to diverse modern societies. His frequent descriptions of degenerate people in isolated rural areas or decaying urban neighborhoods connect poverty and supposed genetic degradation. The name of Lovecraft's cat, which he owned from childhood until 1904, reflects casual racism so normalized in his household that a deeply offensive slur was used as a pet's name. This detail, often mentioned in biographical discussions, exemplifies how thoroughly racist attitudes permeated his environment. He didn't see anything wrong with this name because racist language was ordinary in his family context. However, it's crucial to note that Lovecraft's views evolved somewhat over his lifetime. His later correspondence shows moderation of his most extreme positions. His friendship with several Jewish writers and colleagues, including his wife Sonia, despite their separation, challenged some of his prejudices. His political views shifted leftward during the Great Depression, and he expressed support for Roosevelt's New Deal programs, which would have aided the very immigrant communities he'd previously despised. Some scholars argue that his racism was primarily driven by fear of social and economic change, rather than by commitment to racial ideology. Lovecraft felt overwhelmed by modernity, by changes he couldn't control, and his racism provided a framework for understanding why the world felt threatening. As he gained confidence in his later years, as he developed actual friendships with diverse people through correspondence, some of his virulent prejudice softened. But this evolution was incomplete and doesn't erase the harm of his earlier positions. Even his later, more moderate views would be considered racist today. He never fully repudiated his earlier statements, never underwent the kind of thorough rethinking that would represent genuine transformation. He died before World War II, and the Holocaust forced many Americans to confront where racist logic leads, and we can't know how these events might have further changed his thinking. The question of how to engage with Lovecraft's work, given his racism, remains contested. Some argue his work should be rejected entirely, that his prejudices so thoroughly permeate his fiction that it cannot be separated from them. Others suggest that while acknowledging the racism, we can still appreciate his literary innovations and his influence on horror fiction. Still others attempt to reclaim and reinterpret his work, creating new stories that explicitly challenge the racist elements of the original mythos. The horror community has engaged in extensive discussion about Lovecraft's legacy. The World Fantasy Award, given annually for excellence in fantasy fiction, originally featured a bust of Lovecraft as its trophy. In 2015, following petitions and discussions about the appropriateness of honoring Lovecraft this way, the award was redesigned. This change reflected growing recognition that while Lovecraft's literary contributions are significant, centering him as the face of the fantasy genre was troubling given his beliefs. Contemporary writers working with Lovecraftian themes often explicitly grapple with the racism embedded in the source material. Authors like Victor Laval, N.K. Jemisin, and others have created stories that maintain cosmic horror's essential features while rejecting its racist elements. Laval's novella, The Ballad of Black Tom, retells the horror at Red Hook from the perspective of a black protagonist, revealing how Lovecraft's original story encoded racist fears, and reimagining the narrative through a lens that takes racism seriously as a real-world horror. Matt Ruff's novel Lovecraft Country and the subsequent HBO series engaged even more directly with this tension, creating a narrative where black characters in 1950s America encounter both Lovecraftian cosmic horror and the very real horrors of racism and segregation. The work suggests that for many Americans, racism was and is a more immediate terror than any cosmic entity, while also showing how cosmic horror's themes of helplessness and insignificance resonate with experiences of systemic oppression. These reinterpretations raise important questions about cultural property and creative transformation. Does addressing Lovecraft's racism while using his creations somehow excuse or minimize his prejudice? Or does it represent a kind of cultural justice, taking tools he created and using them for purposes he would have opposed? Can we separate useful literary innovations from the beliefs of their creator, and should we? There's no universal consensus on these questions. Different readers, scholars, and creators come to different conclusions based on their own experiences and values. What's clear is that ignoring Lovecraft's racism is no longer acceptable in serious discussions of his work. The prejudice was too integral to his worldview and too influential on his fiction to be bracketed off as irrelevant biographical detail. For many readers, especially those from groups Lovecraft demonized, engaging with his work requires constant negotiation between appreciating literary craft and confronting hurtful representations. The experience of reading Lovecraft can be alienating and painful when encountering passages that dehumanize people like yourself, even when the broader story might be compelling. This isn't oversensitivity or presentism. It's the direct impact of Lovecraft's choices as a writer. The conversation about Lovecraft and racism also raises broader questions about how we engage with problematic art and artists more generally. What do we do with creative works that are both influential and harmful? How do we acknowledge historical context without using it to excuse prejudice? Can we learn from and appreciate aspects of work while condemning other aspects? These questions extend beyond Lovecraft to many canonical artists and writers whose personal beliefs or representations in their work cause harm. The final years of Howard Phillips Lovecraft's life were marked by increasing isolation, poverty, and physical decline, yet also by some of his finest creative work. He had returned to Providence in 1926 after his unsuccessful attempt to make a life in New York, moving back in with his aunts and settling into what would be his final decade. These years saw him produce his most ambitious stories, while simultaneously sliding deeper into financial hardship that would eventually contribute to his early death. Lovecraft's daily routine during these years followed a nocturnal pattern. He would sleep late, often not rising until afternoon, then spend his evening and night hours reading, writing, and composing the voluminous letters that connected him to his literary circle. He took long walks through Providence's oldest neighborhoods, particularly around College Hill and Benefit Street, absorbing the colonial architecture and atmosphere he loved. These walks often extended into the early morning hours, with Lovecraft wandering the empty streets, imagining how they had looked in the 18th century. His literary output during this period was remarkable considering his circumstances. He wrote The Call of Cthulhu in 1926, The Color Out of Space in 1927, The Dunwich Horror in 1928, At the Mountains of Madness in 1931, and The Shadow over Innsmouth in 1931. These stories, which would become his most famous and influential works, earned him almost nothing during his lifetime. At the Mountains of Madness was rejected by Weird Tales and only published in 1936 in Astounding Stories. The Shadow over Innsmouth was published as a small paperback book in 1936, the only story to appear in book form during Lovecraft's life. His financial situation grew increasingly desperate. He lived on a small trust fund from his mother's estate, barely a few dollars a week, supplemented by irregular payments for revision work. He couldn't afford proper heating in winter and often wore multiple layers of clothing indoors. His diet consisted mainly of cheap staples: bread, cheese, canned beans, crackers. He would go hungry rather than ask for help, his pride preventing him from accepting what he saw as charity, even when friends offered assistance. This malnutrition contributed to his declining health. He had always been somewhat frail, but by the mid-1930s, he was experiencing increasingly severe symptoms. He suffered from chronic pain in his abdomen, persistent fatigue, and dramatic weight loss. He had never been robust, but photographs from his final years show someone gaunt and visibly unwell. Yet he delayed seeking medical attention, partly because he couldn't afford doctors and partly because he feared what they might find. His isolation was both chosen and imposed. He preferred his own company and his correspondence to actual social interaction, but poverty also prevented travel or participation in events that required money. He made occasional trips to visit friends. His 1934 trip to Florida to visit Robert Barlow, a young writer who would later become Lovecraft's literary executor, was one of his last adventures outside New England. But mostly he remained in Providence, in his small apartment, writing and dreaming of other worlds. The letters he wrote during these years reveal his emotional state. He was often melancholic, reflecting on his failures, his poverty, and his inability to succeed in any conventional way. He wrote about feeling like a relic from another era, fundamentally unsuited to the modern world. Yet his letters also showed engagement with ideas, enthusiasm for his friends' work, and continued intellectual curiosity. He read widely despite his poverty, using public libraries and borrowing books from correspondents. By late 1936, his symptoms had become too severe to ignore. He was experiencing intense abdominal pain, had lost significant weight, and was struggling with basic tasks. In February 1937, he finally consulted a doctor who quickly diagnosed cancer of the intestines. The disease was far too advanced for treatment. Cancer had spread throughout his abdomen, and the doctor estimated he had at most a few months to live. Lovecraft was hospitalized at Jane Brown Memorial Hospital in Providence, the same hospital where both his parents had died. He spent his final weeks in considerable pain, though morphine provided some relief. Friends visited when they could, and he maintained correspondence with several people almost until the end. Robert Barlow visited and took notes on Lovecraft's final days, preserving details that would otherwise have been lost. On March 15, 1937, at 7:00 a.m., Howard Phillips Lovecraft died. He was 46 years old. The cause of death was listed as cancer of the small intestine and malnutrition. His suffering at the end was considerable, and his death came as something of a relief to those who'd watched him waste away. He was buried in the Phillips family plot at Swan Point Cemetery in Providence, initially in an unmarked grave. News of his death spread slowly through his correspondence network. There were no obituaries in major newspapers, no public recognition that anything significant had been lost. To the wider world, Lovecraft was unknown. He'd published mostly in pulp magazines under his own name, earning perhaps $1,000 total from his fiction during his lifetime. He left no estate, no money, just boxes of letters, manuscripts, and personal papers. But among the small community of weird fiction writers and readers, his death was recognized as significant. August Derleth and Donald Wandre, two friends and correspondents, immediately began working to preserve and publish Lovecraft's work. They collected his stories from magazines, gathered unpublished manuscripts, and assembled them for publication. When mainstream publishers showed no interest in a collection of Lovecraft's work, Derleth and Wandre founded their own publishing house, Arkham House, specifically to publish Lovecraft. The first Arkham House book, The Outsider and Others, appeared in 1939, collecting Lovecraft's stories in a proper hardcover edition. The print run was small, just 1,268 copies, but it marked the beginning of Lovecraft's transformation from forgotten pulp writer to recognized author. Arkham House would continue publishing Lovecraft's work, along with stories by other weird fiction writers. For decades, playing a crucial role in keeping these works available and building Lovecraft's posthumous reputation. The rediscovery of Lovecraft was gradual but steady. During the 1940s, his work remained known mainly to dedicated fans of weird fiction. But in the 1950s, his influence began appearing in the work of younger writers. Fritz Leiber, Ray Bradbury, and other science fiction and horror writers acknowledged Lovecraft's influence on their work. The publication of Supernatural Horror in Literature, Lovecraft's critical essay on horror fiction, showed readers that he'd been a thoughtful critic as well as a writer. The 1960s brought a surge of interest in Lovecraft, coinciding with the paperback revolution that made his work widely available for the first time. Publishers like Ballantine Books issued Lovecraft collections with striking cover art that caught the eye of young readers exploring horror and fantasy. College students discovered his work, and his philosophy of cosmicism resonated with the countercultural questioning of traditional values and beliefs. Academic attention followed popular interest. By the 1970s, scholars were writing seriously about Lovecraft, analyzing his work with the tools of literary criticism. His stories appeared in college syllabi. His influence on subsequent horror and science fiction was traced in doctoral dissertations. The strange, isolated pulp writer who died in poverty was being recognized as a significant literary figure. This recognition continued growing through subsequent decades. The 1980s saw Lovecraft's influence explode in role-playing games, with Call of Cthulhu becoming one of the most popular horror RPGs. The 1990s and 2000s brought numerous film and television adaptations, though few captured what made his work distinctive. The 2010s saw his ideas permeate popular culture to the point where Lovecraftian horror became a recognized genre category. The Providence that Lovecraft loved has embraced his memory, though it came slowly. For decades after his death, the city largely ignored its association with him. But eventually, Providence recognized the value of its Lovecraft connection. Tours now guide visitors to locations that inspired his stories. Lovecraft Arts and Sciences, a store dedicated to his work and weird fiction generally, operates in Providence. Conventions and events celebrate his legacy. The house where he spent his final years displays a plaque commemorating his residence. His grave at Swan Point Cemetery, initially unmarked, finally received a proper headstone in 1977, 40 years after his death. Fans funded the memorial, which bears his name, dates, and the phrase, "I am Providence," taken from one of his letters. The grave has become something of a pilgrimage site for fans, often decorated with offerings. Coins, notes, small Cthulhu figurines, left by visitors from around the world. The Library of Congress has acquired many of Lovecraft's manuscripts and letters, recognizing their cultural significance. Brown University's John Hay Library maintains an extensive Lovecraft collection. Scholars continue producing new editions of his work with improved texts and annotations. His letters, running to thousands of pages, have been collected and published, providing invaluable insight into his life and thought. Yet this rediscovery and celebration has occurred alongside growing recognition of his racism and the harm embedded in his work. The same decades that saw his literary reputation grow also saw increased attention to how his prejudices shaped his fiction. This tension between appreciation of his literary innovations and condemnation of his bigotry defines contemporary engagement with Lovecraft. His influence on horror and speculative fiction is now undeniable. Writers who have never read his work still use tropes and concepts he popularized. Cosmic horror, the Cthulhu Mythos, and the notion that knowledge itself can be corrosive have all become standard elements of genre fiction. His impact extends into film, television, comics, video games, and other media, creating a cultural presence that would have astonished the lonely, poor writer who died thinking himself a failure. The irony is profound. Lovecraft spent his life feeling out of place in his own era, longing for the 18th century, convinced that he'd been born in the wrong time. He died believing his work would be forgotten within years. Instead, he's become more famous and influential with each passing decade, his ideas spreading far beyond anything he imagined. The future he feared and couldn't adapt to has embraced the very things about him that made him feel like an anachronism. His elaborate prose, his intellectual approach to horror, his philosophy of cosmic insignificance. Howard Phillips Lovecraft's life was marked by failure, isolation, and struggle. But his death marked only the beginning of his true impact, as the work he created in obscurity slowly found the vast audience he never knew existed, transforming him from a forgotten pulp writer into one of the most influential horror authors in literary history. There's something peculiar about Lovecraft's journey from page to screen. His work, so dependent on the limits of human language to describe the indescribable, on suggesting rather than showing, seems fundamentally unsuited to visual media. How do you film something that's explicitly beyond human comprehension? How do you show what the author insisted couldn't be shown without destroying the very essence of the horror? Yet filmmakers, game designers, and creators across media have been drawn to Lovecraft's work for decades, attempting to translate cosmic horror into forms Lovecraft himself never imagined. The earliest Lovecraft film adaptation came in 1963 with The Haunted Palace, directed by Roger Corman and starring Vincent Price. Despite its title, borrowed from Edgar Allan Poe, the film actually adapted Lovecraft's The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. Corman was in the midst of his Poe adaptation series and knew that Poe's name sold tickets while Lovecraft's didn't. The film captured some of Lovecraft's atmosphere: the New England Gothic setting, the family curse, the ancient evil, but necessarily simplified and made more concrete what Lovecraft had left ambiguous. This pattern would repeat throughout Lovecraft adaptation history. Filmmakers attracted to his concepts but struggling with his execution, drawn to his ideas but forced to make them more visual, more active, more conventionally dramatic than Lovecraft's originals. The medium demands what the source material deliberately withholds: clear images, visible monsters, dramatic confrontations. The 1970 film The Dunwich Horror, starring Dean Stockwell, attempted a relatively faithful adaptation of one of Lovecraft's more filmable stories. The tale features a visible monster, dramatic ritual magic, and clear stakes: the potential destruction of the world. Yet even this comparatively straightforward story proved challenging. The film added romance, sexual content, and conventional horror beats that weren't in Lovecraft's original, attempting to make the story more commercially viable. Stuart Gordon's 1985 film, Reanimator, marked a turning point in Lovecraft adaptation. Rather than attempting faithful adaptation of Lovecraft's tone, Gordon embraced dark comedy, gore, and manic energy. The film, based loosely on Lovecraft's Herbert West Reanimator, was wildly successful in its own terms, spawning sequels and becoming a cult classic. But it was successful precisely because it didn't try to capture Lovecraft's cosmic dread. Instead, it mined his stories for outrageous premises and pushed them towards splatter comedy. Gordon would continue adapting Lovecraft with From Beyond, Castle Freak, and Dagon, each taking similar approaches, using Lovecraft stories as springboards for horror films that had their own aesthetic distinct from the source material. Dagon, despite its title, actually adapted The Shadow over Innsmouth, relocating it to Spain and updating it to the present day. The film captured some of Lovecraft's themes about identity and transformation, but necessarily made concrete what Lovecraft had suggested. The challenge of filming Lovecraft became a common topic in horror film criticism. How do you show a creature that drives people mad by its very appearance? If you make it too concrete, it becomes just another movie monster, losing the cosmic horror that made it terrifying. If you keep it vague and suggestive, audiences feel cheated, wanting to see the monster they came to the theater to experience. This tension has never been fully resolved. Some of the most successful Lovecraft-influenced films have been those that captured his themes and atmosphere while not directly adapting his stories. John Carpenter's The Thing, though based on a John W. Campbell story, embodies Lovecraftian horror perfectly. An alien entity that violates biological categories, that can't be trusted, that represents nature as fundamentally hostile to human existence. The film's practical effects, showing grotesque transformations and impossible biological forms, visualized cosmic horror more effectively than many direct Lovecraft adaptations. Ridley Scott's Alien similarly captured Lovecraftian themes without adapting a specific story. The derelict spacecraft, the ancient alien pilot, the creature that represents biology optimized for predation without consciousness or morality. All these elements feel deeply Lovecraftian. H.R. Giger's creature designs, with their biomechanical aesthetic and disturbing sexual undertones, visualized something genuinely alien in ways that resonated with Lovecraft's cosmic horror. Guillermo del Toro has been perhaps the most vocal contemporary filmmaker about Lovecraft's influence. His films Hellboy, Pan's Labyrinth, and The Shape of Water all show Lovecraftian influences in their creature designs and their treatment of the monstrous. Del Toro has attempted to make direct Lovecraft adaptations, particularly At the Mountains of Madness, but has been repeatedly thwarted by studios concerned about the commercial viability of expensive, bleak horror. The difficulty of adapting At the Mountains of Madness exemplifies the challenges of filming Lovecraft. The story requires Antarctic settings, elaborate creature effects for the elder things and shoggoths, extended sequences describing ancient cities and biological specimens, and a tone of scientific horror rather than visceral thrills. Studios have been unwilling to invest the necessary budget in what would essentially be a downbeat horror film, without conventional heroes or satisfying resolution. Television has had its own relationship with Lovecraft. The anthology series Night Gallery adapted several Lovecraft stories in the 1970s with mixed results. True Detective Season 1 in 2014 didn't adapt Lovecraft directly, but was saturated with Lovecraftian imagery and themes. Cosmic horror, ancient cults, corrupting knowledge, and the suggestion of vast conspiracies beyond human comprehension. The show's final revelation, somewhat controversial among fans, attempted to visualize cosmic horror while keeping it ambiguous. The 2020 HBO series Lovecraft Country, based on Matt Ruff's novel, took a different approach entirely. Rather than trying to film Lovecraft faithfully, it used Lovecraftian horror as one element in a story about Black Americans in the 1950s confronting both racism and cosmic entities. The show explicitly engaged with Lovecraft's racism, with characters aware of and commenting on the prejudices embedded in the mythos they were encountering. This represented a new model for Lovecraft adaptation, using his ideas while critiquing their origins. Video games have arguably been more successful at capturing Lovecraftian horror than films. The interactive nature of games allows for exploration, discovery, and the gradual revelation of terrible truths in ways that feel more aligned with Lovecraft's narrative structures. Games can take time, can prioritize atmosphere over action, and can make players complicit in acquiring forbidden knowledge. Call of Cthulhu: Dark Corners of the Earth attempted a relatively direct adaptation of Lovecraft, including a lengthy segment adapting The Shadow over Innsmouth. The game captured the paranoia and mounting dread of Lovecraft's stories, though technical limitations and gameplay requirements necessitated more combat than purists might have liked. Bloodborne, while not directly adapting Lovecraft, created one of the most thoroughly Lovecraftian game experiences. The game begins as Victorian Gothic horror, but gradually reveals cosmic horror lurking beneath. Players discover that what they thought was a werewolf plague actually involves ancient gods, alien dimensions, and knowledge that transforms those who seek it. The game's environmental storytelling, gradual revelation of terrible truths, and emphasis on incomprehensible cosmic forces all feel deeply Lovecraftian. The Amnesia series and Soma by Frictional Games explored cosmic horror through interactive experiences, emphasizing vulnerability and psychological terror. These games made players powerless against cosmic forces, unable to fight, but only to flee, hide, and slowly piece together what was happening. This helplessness captures something essential about Lovecraft's work that action-focused adaptations lose. Tabletop role-playing games provided another medium where Lovecraft's influence flourished. Call of Cthulhu, first published in 1981, became one of the most enduring horror RPGs. The game's mechanics emphasized investigation, sanity loss, and the ultimate futility of fighting cosmic forces. Characters slowly went mad as they learned terrible truths, and campaigns often ended with player characters dying, going insane, or achieving only Pyrrhic victories. The game's success demonstrated that people wanted to engage with Lovecraftian horror in participatory ways, creating their own stories within the mythos framework. The community that formed around Call of Cthulhu generated thousands of scenarios, campaigns, and supplements, expanding the mythos in directions Lovecraft never imagined, while maintaining the essential tone of cosmic dread. Comics and graphic novels have also adapted Lovecraft extensively. Alan Moore's Providence trilogy offered sophisticated engagement with Lovecraft's work, incorporating biographical details about Lovecraft himself while exploring the mythos through a journalist's investigations. The visual medium allowed artists to depict cosmic horror in ways that were striking without being too definitive, using artistic style to suggest the incomprehensible. Music has been influenced by Lovecraft as well, particularly in heavy metal and dark ambient genres. Bands like Metallica, Iron Maiden, and countless others have written songs inspired by Lovecraft's stories. The doom metal band Electric Wizard saturates their music with Lovecraftian themes. The band Darkest of the Hillside Thickets has built their entire catalog around Lovecraft references. This musical engagement demonstrates how thoroughly Lovecraft's ideas have permeated popular culture. The question of what makes a successful Lovecraft adaptation remains contested. Some argue that faithfulness to the source material is essential, that capturing Lovecraft's prose style and philosophy is more important than exciting visuals or commercial viability. Others contend that Lovecraft's ideas need to be transformed for new media, that successful adaptations capture the spirit while changing the specifics. What's clear is that Lovecraft's work continues attracting creators across media despite the inherent challenges of adaptation. There's something about his cosmic horror, his philosophy of human insignificance, and his creation of a shared mythological universe that continues resonating with artists and audiences. Even unsuccessful adaptations often introduce new readers to Lovecraft's original work, expanding his influence. The future of Lovecraft adaptation will likely continue grappling with the same tensions that have always existed. How do you visualize the unvisualizable? How do you show cosmic horror without making it too concrete? How do you engage with Lovecraft's ideas while confronting the racism embedded in his work? Different creators will answer these questions differently, but the questions themselves seem essential to any serious engagement with Lovecraft in visual media. Walk into any bookstore's horror section today, and you'll find the echoes of Lovecraft everywhere, even in books that never mention tentacles or ancient gods. The DNA of cosmic horror, that specific blend of existential dread, incomprehensible vastness, and the terror of knowledge itself, has become one of horror's dominant modes. Writers who have never read Lovecraft directly still work in frameworks he established, use tropes he popularized, and explore themes he first brought into horror fiction. Understanding Lovecraft's influence on contemporary horror means tracing how his innovations have been adopted, adapted, and transformed by generations of subsequent creators. Stephen King, perhaps the most successful horror writer of all time, has acknowledged Lovecraft's influence repeatedly. While King's approach to horror differs significantly from Lovecraft's, King writes about recognizable people in believable situations, while Lovecraft wrote about cosmic forces beyond human comprehension. King has nevertheless incorporated Lovecraftian elements throughout his work. His epic novel about an ancient evil in a small Maine town, features an entity that exists outside normal time and space, that may be older than the universe itself. The Mist presents interdimensional horror in explicitly Lovecraftian terms. King's influence, in turn, has spread Lovecraftian concepts to vast mainstream audiences who might never encounter Lovecraft directly. Readers who have absorbed King's work have been exposed to cosmic horror's fundamental ideas. That reality is stranger and more terrible than we imagine, that there are forces beyond human comprehension, that knowledge can be corrupting. This transmission of Lovecraftian themes through intermediary popular authors has made cosmic horror's basic premises familiar even to people who have never heard Lovecraft's name. Thomas Ligotti represents another stream of Lovecraft's influence, one more philosophically sophisticated and stylistically experimental than most horror fiction. Ligotti's stories embrace cosmic horror's bleakest implications, exploring consciousness as horror, existence as nightmare, and awareness itself as something to be escaped. His collection, Songs of a Dead Dreamer, and his philosophical work, the conspiracy against the human race pushed Lovecraft's cosmicism to its logical conclusions, arguing that consciousness is a tragic mistake and that the best outcome would be the cessation of all sentient life. Ligotti's work influenced the first season of True Detective, where creator Nick Pizzolatto incorporated ideas from Ligotti's philosophy into the character of Rustin Cohle. This transmission, from Lovecraft to Ligotti to prestige television, demonstrates how cosmic horror's ideas continue evolving and reaching new audiences through new media. Laird Barron has written extensively in Lovecraftian modes while bringing contemporary sensibilities and more sophisticated prose to cosmic horror. His stories often feature working-class protagonists, bodyguards, private investigators, criminals, encountering cosmic forces in the modern world. Barron maintains cosmic horror's essential features: vast inhuman forces, corrupting knowledge, human insignificance, while updating the settings and avoiding Lovecraft's purple prose and dated prejudices. China Miéville, a British writer known for his new weird fiction, has engaged with Lovecraft's legacy in complex ways. Miéville acknowledges Lovecraft's influence while explicitly rejecting his politics and some of his aesthetic choices. Novels like Perdido Street Station and The Scar feature genuinely alien creatures and realities that exceed human comprehension, but place them in elaborately detailed secondary worlds rather than in cosmic voids. Miéville demonstrates how Lovecraft's innovations can be divorced from his specific worldview and used for different ends. Jeff Vandermeer's Southern Reach trilogy, particularly the first novel Annihilation, represents cosmic horror adapted for the 21st century. The trilogy features Area X, a zone where reality operates according to different rules, where transformation and change occur without moral meaning, where human investigations reveal only deeper mysteries. Vandermeer captures Lovecraft's essential insight: that reality might be fundamentally incomprehensible, while writing with contemporary literary sophistication and avoiding Lovecraft's racism. The success of Annihilation and its film adaptation demonstrated that cosmic horror could appeal to literary audiences and not just genre fans. The novel won prestigious awards, was taught in creative writing programs, and showed that Lovecraft's core concepts could be explored through contemporary literary fiction. Caitlin R. Kiernan has written extensively in Lovecraftian modes, often setting stories in Providence or nearby locations that Lovecraft himself used. Kiernan's work engages with Lovecraft's themes while bringing queer sensibilities and feminist perspectives to cosmic horror. Novels like The Drowning Girl and The Red Tree explore how cosmic horror intersects with psychological horror, how encounters with the inexplicable affect already fragile psyches, and how Lovecraft's ideas can be explored from perspectives he never considered. N.K. Jemisin's The City We Became takes Lovecraft's xenophobia and inverts it, creating a story where New York City itself becomes sentient to fight off an interdimensional horror that represents gentrification, colonization, and the destruction of diversity. The novel explicitly names Lovecraft, critiques his racism, and reclaims cosmic horror for the very communities Lovecraft demonized. This represents a sophisticated engagement with Lovecraft's legacy, using his innovations while condemning his bigotry. Victor Laval's novella, The Ballad of Black Tom, retells Lovecraft's The Horror at Red Hook from the perspective of a black musician in 1920s New York. The story reveals how Lovecraft's original encoded racist paranoia about immigrants and jazz culture, then reimagines the narrative to center the humanity and perspective of the very people Lovecraft portrayed as threats. Laval demonstrates how Lovecraft's stories can be rewritten to challenge, rather than perpetuate his prejudices. The rise of cosmic horror as a recognized genre category owes much to online communities and social media. Creepypasta communities generated countless stories exploring cosmic horror themes, often explicitly Lovecraftian. The SCP Foundation, a collaborative fiction project describing a secret organization containing anomalous entities, represents cosmic horror adapted to wiki format, allowing hundreds of writers to contribute to a shared universe of incomprehensible horrors. This democratization of cosmic horror, where anyone can write and share stories exploring these themes, has led to enormous proliferation of Lovecraft-influenced fiction. Some of it is derivative, but the best demonstrates how cosmic horror's essential insights remain relevant and generative. The terror of knowledge, the incomprehensibility of reality, the insignificance of humanity. These themes continue resonating with contemporary anxieties. Horror games have particularly embraced Lovecraftian themes. Bloodborne, Eternal Darkness, Darkest Dungeon, and many other games explore cosmic horror through interactive experiences. These games make players actively engage with forbidden knowledge, choose whether to pursue understanding despite the costs, and experience directly the consequences of encountering the incomprehensible. The medium's interactivity creates new possibilities for cosmic horror that literature can't quite replicate. Academic attention to cosmic horror has grown significantly. Scholars analyze how Lovecraft's philosophy relates to contemporary theories about consciousness, existence, and meaning. His work appears in discussions of object-oriented ontology, speculative realism, and other philosophical movements, questioning human-centered perspectives on reality. Theorists like Graham Harman and Eugene Thacker have written extensively about Lovecraft's philosophical implications. This philosophical engagement suggests that cosmic horror offers more than entertainment. It provides frameworks for thinking about genuinely difficult questions. What if consciousness is rare and unimportant in the universe? What if our categories for understanding reality are fundamentally inadequate? What if the universe operates according to principles we can't grasp? These aren't just horror scenarios. They're genuine philosophical possibilities that cosmic horror takes seriously. The environmental crisis has given cosmic horror new relevance. Climate change represents a slow-moving catastrophe that exceeds individual human capacity to comprehend fully or to combat effectively. It's a cosmic horror in the literal sense. Planetary forces operating on scales that dwarf human concerns, changes that will outlast any individual life, knowledge that should change how we live, but that we struggle to integrate into daily existence. Several contemporary writers have explicitly connected Lovecraftian cosmic horror to climate anxiety. The COVID-19 pandemic similarly evoked cosmic horror's essential features. An invisible threat that disregarded human meaning, that exposed how fragile our structures are, that killed without moral logic. The pandemic made visible how much of reality operates according to biological and physical principles that don't care about human desires or beliefs. This real-world cosmic horror made Lovecraft's philosophy feel less abstract and more like accurate description of human existence. Contemporary cosmic horror often interrogates questions Lovecraft didn't address or addressed only from his limited perspective. What does cosmic horror mean for communities already experiencing real-world horrors of oppression and violence? How do cosmic horror's themes land differently when approached from feminist, queer, or decolonial perspectives? Can cosmic horror be reclaimed and redirected toward progressive rather than reactionary ends? These questions generate exciting contemporary work that maintains cosmic horror's essential insights, while transforming its politics and expanding its perspectives. The genre Lovecraft founded has grown far beyond anything he imagined, adapted by writers with worldviews he would have found incomprehensible, used to explore themes he never considered. This transformation demonstrates both the power of his original innovations and the necessity of moving beyond his limitations. Tonight, we've traced the strange, complicated life of Howard Phillips Lovecraft from his troubled childhood in Providence through his struggles as a writer to his early death in poverty and obscurity, then beyond death to his gradual rediscovery, and his current status as one of horror's most influential figures. We've explored how his philosophy of cosmicism transformed horror fiction, how his mythos became a collaborative universe that continues growing, and how his deeply problematic prejudices complicate any celebration of his literary achievements. We've seen how his work has been adapted, transformed, and reimagined across multiple media, and how contemporary creators continue finding new possibilities within cosmic horror's frameworks. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the life and legacy of H.P. Lovecraft. If you're already drifting off, then our mission is complete. But if you're still awake, perhaps another deep dive through one of our previous episodes will carry you gently into slumber. Until we meet again in these quiet hours, may you find beauty in the vast cosmos that surrounds us. May you face uncertainty without losing wonder. And may you carry forward something that honors the best in human creativity while rejecting the worst in human prejudice.